We are here today because the deaths of 800,000 individuals in a 3-month span. So many people dying in such a short amount of time does not happen by accident. This genocide was the result of the specific and intentional actions by someone or a group of people who meticulously planned and orchestrated the atrocities that have brought us here today. You'll hear from Nora Bakarina, who will explain her personal experiences of the genocide, and from Philip Gervinovich, who will explain in graphic detail the brutal murder of entire families. Through the events of this trial, we will prove that Fulgence Kayishima is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of crimes against humanity.
I'm sure you are all aware of the atrocities that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. We are here to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Fulgence Kayishima is not to blame for the organization and killing of the Tutsi people of Rwanda. The genocide was caused by an overwhelming tension between two cultural groups that was emphasized incredibly by the long-term effects of colonialism. This was a genocide off the motivations of people's own personal motivations, not that of our defendant. You will hear from our defendant along with our witness, Shima Hibarama, who will establish the lack of influence my defendant had on the killings along with the lack of organization of said genocide, ensuring that such a crime couldn't have been committed by Kayishima, beyond any reasonable doubt of the jury.
Mr. Gervinovich, can you explain what initially drew you to report for this genocide?
An initial shock came when I heard about what happened in Rwanda. It wasn't just because of what happened, but at how little attention the world gave it. Nearly 1 million people were murdered in about 100 days, and that is not only a tragedy, but a failure of humanity on a larger scale. There was almost a global silence around it. It wasn't headlined for long and was framed as a very incomprehensible ethnic conflict, which allowed it for it to be easier to overlook and to be able to look away from it. And so as a journalist, I wasn't going to allow something as big as this to just go silent. I believe that it is my job to go where the silence is the loudest. And so that's when I started, reading reports, talking to the aid workers, watching more footage, etc. And what struck me the most was the absence of personal stories in the media. There were dead bodies and, there were statistics, but there were no individual names, no stories, no voices from the people who had lived right through it. And so I wanted to be able to ask, how could this happen and how do we live in a world where it did?
During your time in Rwanda, what were some of the most significant things you witnessed that shaped your reporting?
I vividly remember walking through a church in Nairobi where hundreds of people had been slaughtered who were only seeking refuge. Their bones and clothing were just left there as a memorial to honor them. It wasn't just the horror that kind of stuck with me to this day, but it was the silence and the stillness and the weight of what had happened in that space. It's something you don't ever really forget. And so I actually met with a bunch of survivors and had conversations and dialogue with them. And a lot of them told me stories that were too painful for them to relive or speak about, such as watching their children die or hiding under bodies to survive or being even betrayed by the person that they thought they had been closest to since they were young. They just needed someone to listen, someone to hear what they had to say. And while I might not have necessarily understood all of their pain, I could somehow help them bear the pain.
Please state your name and nationality.
My name is Nora Bagarinka. I'm a Tutsi from Rwanda.
Can you explain your role in this genocide?
I'm a survivor. For 100 days, I hid and ran until I was able to seek refuge in DRC, as did many others.
Can you describe an experience you had encountering a roadblock occupied by Hutus?
Well, me and my mother, we were walking up the road to this roadblock where we could see many people being separated. As we got closer, soldiers were forcefully separating people based on if they were Tutsi or Hutus. When we got there, Hutu soldiers were approaching us with machetes, threatening our lives if we didn't get in line.
And when the soldiers approached you, what did they do?
They cut my hand with a machete and then they beat my mother.
Can you describe the process of the soldiers' operation of the roadblock?
People would approach the line, they would ask if you were a Tutsi or a Hutu, and we would have to show them our identity cards that the Belgians made us have. They separated us based on if we were Hutu or Tutsi, and then Tutsi people would fall victim to countless horrific acts.
Did these soldiers have any form of communication or process that led to this organization?
Yeah, they had radios where they were given instructions and orders to make this process of the roadblocks.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Please state your name, age, and nationality for the jury.
My name is Fulgence Kayashima. I'm 65 years old, and I'm from Kimuvu, Rwanda.
What was your involvement in the Rwandan radio system?
I have not been involved with any public or private radio stations surrounding the genocide or spread of hate.
How was the mass murdering of the Tutsi people organized?
There were announcements made on radio stations and an overall stigma against the Tutsi people, which encouraged violent crimes and murder. Anywhere you went, you could see some sort of propaganda.
And were you ever involved in developing propaganda?
No, I've never done anything to call for or organize killings against the Tutsi people.
Were you ever aware of any tensions between the Tutsi and Hutu population leading up to the genocide?
Yes, there has been conflict between both parties for as long as I can remember. It was building up for a very long time.
What did you notice during the buildup of this tension?
I noticed that even after the Belgians left our country, their impact was still extremely prevalent. They left in their wake an unstable government that continued to exacerbate the strict social standings, continuing to surmount to a rising tension and hatred for one another.
No further questions, Your Honor.
What is your profession?
I was a police inspector.
What were your duties as a police inspector during the Rwandan genocide?
To carry out justice and serve the Rwandan people.
Is it true you've been evading captivity under a false persona by the United Nations since the events of 1994?
Yes.
When you were evading captivity, your false name was Dainoten Nabushuma, correct?
Yes.
If you were truly innocent of the crimes you have been charged with, why have you evaded arrest?
To maintain my own privacy and safety.
Where were you on April 15th, 1994?
My home in Kimuvu.
Were you aware of the refugees hiding at the Nyanga Church on April 15th?
Yes.
Were you aware of the attempt to burn the church down?
Yes.
Did you source any of the gasoline for the attempt to burn the church?
No.
Were you aware of the bulldozing of the church with 2,000 Tutsis inside?
Yes.
Did you have any involvement? If yes, what?
No. I was aware that there had been conspiracy, but I never took part in the deaths or violence against people.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Please state your name, age, at the time of the genocide, and nationality.
My name is Shima Hamirawa. I was 21 at the time of the genocide, and I am a Tutsi Rwandan.
Can you explain how the judicial system in Rwanda works?
Rwanda has a court system called the Gacaca courts. They are traditional and are used to deal with petty disputes within our villages. They weren't equipped to deal with genocide charges. Even if they were, there was nobody left to organize them after the genocide. We had no way to prosecute perpetrators. There was nobody left empowered to do so.
And who manages the court system in Rwanda?
Well, around the time of the start of the genocide, the judicial system in Rwanda was starting to shift from our traditional system to a Western-led Hutu court. When the genocide ended and the vast majority of Tutsi men were dead, we had nobody left to manage the courts. Judges, lawyers, and tribal leaders were targeted and murdered. The courts that remained were controlled by those who facilitated the genocide, and they weren't going to prosecute their own men.
What is the state of Rwandan judicial system today?
It's much more mixed now. Some villages rely solely on traditional Gacaca courts, whereas the federal judicial court completely runs some. The judicial branch is entwined completely with our current government.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in this trial you have heard from Philip Gravernovich, a reporter, someone who was on the ground during the genocide and saw it with their own eyes. His documentation of the genocide shows that the events during the summer of 1994 were not the result of common ethnic tension, but instead an organized endeavor. The argument by the defense that the genocide is to be blamed on the Belgians and other colonial powers doesn't amount to any serious defense of Mr. Kayashima. No matter what the broader reasons for the genocide were, Mr. Kayashima played a part in the murder of 2,000 people. Fulgence Kayashima was part of the planned and coordinated effort. As we have proven in this trial, he played a role in the destruction of the Kimuvu church, which killed 2,000 Tutsi refugees, all of whom were taking refuge from the chaos and murder outside.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, throughout this trial, you have heard from our defendant and Shima Habarama, both who are able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Fulgence Kayishima not only did not have the power to be at fault for such a genocide, but cannot be held liable for the overall failures in the justice system in Rwanda during the time. The prosecution wants you to believe that our defendant meticulously planned the spread of hatred through radio stations and ordered the killings of thousands of Tutsis. However, no evidence can be established to prove Kayishima's involvement. The prosecution also wants you to believe that our defendant is responsible for the lack of regulation and punishment to the citizens committing such atrocities. This completely ignores the fact that the depleted villages who rely on smaller village courts carry no power, and any attempts possibly made by my defendant would be negated at a lack of centralized power. We cannot ignore the true culprit of these tensions that led to this atrocity. We cannot allow for those that colonized and exploited one group of people while arbitrarily empowering the other. We cannot ignore the effects that this has on the people of Rwanda. We cannot ignore the true reason behind this genocide, one that we cannot put on our defendant.